Good afternoon, students. So today we will have the third class on the novel Pride and Prejudice. In the earlier classes, we have already discussed about about the writer, that is Jane Austen, as a novelist. And in the last class, we actually talked about the novel, that is the story of the novel. But our today's topic is going to deal with we will deal with the themes of the novel, theme of marriage in the novel. And here we are having the marriage is one of the important themes in this novel. In this here we find that Jane Austen is writing a novel in which she is trying to present marriage as a social institution, marriage which is not related to love, or also a novel where marriage does not find a place as someone's individual or personal thing. It is presented as a social institution, and the society always comes in when we talk about the novel. Here we find that the novel, the first sentence of the novel, opening sentence of the novel itself gives us an idea of what Jane Austen wants to present in the novel, because the very first sentence of the novel states the fact that a young man with a good earning or a good income is without doubt in search of a wife. So this sets the motion of the novel, and we find that keeping in terms with the subject of the novel, marriages take place consecutively in the novel. And the first part of the first chapter of the novel, in fact, presents the situation where Mrs. Bennet is always presented as the mother of her 5 grown-up daughters. And we find that she is obsessed with the idea about marriage and about marrying of her daughters to wealthy young bachelors. So consequent upon this, we find that Jane Austen presents the novel in such a way where we find that this theme, which is set in the first part of the novel, is followed in the later part of the novel. Here we find that Jane Austen presents the characters, these 5 young girls, and towards the end of the novel we find that all the characters are married off as was wished by their mother, Mrs. Bennet. So in the novel deals with many relationships, and these relationships which result in marriage. The first one is that of Jane and the first one is that of Jane. The 4 marriages we find in the story. The first one is that of Jane and Bingley, and here we find that Jane is presented as the pretty daughter, the eldest daughter. She is sweet and presented as a very gentle girl, very girly, who is good looking, also has all the qualities which is desired by a young bachelor. We find her that Jane is also presented as a very quiet type of girl, a sober girl, a girl who is not very presented as behaving in a very simple way. And we find that in the first, this marriage between Jane is actually arranged, or it actually happens in course of in the first part of the novel. It's not the marriage, but it's the relationship which develops, and later on it develops into it culminates in the marriage. So here we find that she is also Jane Austen is also presenting through this relationship one important thing, that the society of the times, where it was very important that women or girls, young girls, should be married, and not only married, a marriage was considered successful if her husband was, or if the young man was, a rich person. and this is shown throughout the novel. We find that the character who appears is Mr. Bingley, who appears in the first part of the novel. He is presented as a rich person who is taking Longbourn on rent. This is a place which is a real big area which was let out on rent, and Mr. Bingley is presented as the young man who comes to occupy that place, and we find that this is news for Mrs. Bennet, and Mrs. Bennet instigates her husband Mr. Bennet to develop a friendship with the family of Mr. Bingley, consisting of Bingley and her sisters. And Bingley is presented as a wealthy person. He is good looking, he is a very attractive character, handsome and beautiful. And as the flow of the novel progresses, we find that Mr. Bingley throws a ball, and according to the wish of Mrs. Bennet, the daughters Jane and Elizabeth and the younger ones also, they visit the Mr. Bingley and are participating in the ball that has been organized. And here we find that as was expected, Mr. Bingley dances with Jane, and further on that relationship develops, which after many instances, when Jane falls sick, Jane stays back in the house of Mr. Bingley, and in this way the relationship develops, which ultimately ends in a marriage. After this, Mr. Bingley is also presented as a modest person with good temper. He was presented as very successful in the society, and instantly Jane and Bingley falls in love. After this, we have this relationship develops. The second relationship which is shown in the novel is the relationship which develops between Elizabeth, the second daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. And incidentally, Mr. Bingley and Darcy are friends, and Mr. Bingley was the person who was already known to Darcy's sister, and there was also a talk about this connection between Mr. Bingley's sister and Darcy. But we find that Mr. Bingley, Elizabeth, the second character, the second daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, is presented as one who loves her sister Jane, and we find that in course of the novel she goes out of her way to help Jane and also to see that the relationship develops. And as a consequence of her intervention, all misunderstanding between them is cleared, and Jane and Bingley are reunited. But we find that ultimately this first relationship develops into a success. After this, we have the for the second relationship, Elizabeth is a character who is very much conscious about love in her married life, and she is also presented as a character who is very wise, who is thoughtful, who is always the interest for her, who was liked by her father, and father's favorite also. And Elizabeth is presented to be very balanced, and love is for her was the most important thing, which leads to a lot of misunderstanding, though Darcy finds interest in her in the later course of the novel. And this happens also in course of the story. We find that Mr. Bennet or Mrs. Bennet wanted her to get married to Mr. Collins, who was presented as a distant relative who was supposed to inherit the property of Mr. Bennet. Now this has another angle because women did not enjoy any good position in the society of that time, and since Mr. Bennet did not have any sons, he had only all were daughters. So it was the novel shows that the property could not be inherited, and in this case Mr. Collins is the person who is chosen, and and Mr. Collins also gives a proposal of marriage to Elizabeth, but Elizabeth rejects the proposal, and but this rejection of proposal, of course in the novel it is presented that later on Elizabeth's friend Charlotte actually gets married to Mr. Collins. So another marriage is successful in the novel. So we find that in Elizabeth's case, her first impression of Darcy was that he was very proud and arrogant, and also she thinks that his wealth and high social status also made him look down upon others. So Darcy is presented as proud and a person who is who is always trying to yeah. So yeah. So we find that though in course of the story Elizabeth at first is rejected by Darcy, and there is a lot of misunderstanding between them, ultimately as the story progresses they both start knowing each other and come to know each other better. All the prejudices they had about each other was removed, and in the towards the at least most part of the end of the novel we find that they fall in love and join hands in a holy matrimony. The other marriage is that of presented in the novel is that I have already talked about Charlotte and Collins, already I have said, and we find that the difference in character of Elizabeth and Charlotte, also her friend, because Charlotte is presented as a girl typical of those times, and for her marriage was related to wealth and fortune, and she marries Mr. Collins not looking at his qualities but thinking that he has a honorable position and is a man of fortune. So Charlotte only wants a comfortable life, a high social position and better wealth, and this substantiates or this presents the viewpoint of the society which was there in those times. And the last marriage which is presented is the difference is that Collins is a person who does not know what love is all about, and after Elizabeth rejects her he shifts his interest to Charlotte and ultimately marries her. So this marriage also takes place, and the last part of the novel is dealing with the last marriage which takes place in the novel, and that is the relationship between Lydia and Wickham. Now Lydia is the third daughter of Bennet, and she has been presented as a spoilt girl, she has been presented as arrogant, immature, all sorts of qualities were there, and she falls in love with Mr. Wickham, who is presented as a military man. And but the character of Wickham is really presented as very dubious. He is very much in debt. He is a gambler. And because of this, the families refuse to give permission about the marriage, and ultimately they elope. But as towards the end of the towards the end of the novel, we find that everything ends very smoothly, because Wickham and Lydia are found, and their all settlements of debt of Wickham is arranged. And here we find that in this case Darcy plays an important role, and ultimately we find that though they elope, ultimately the family welcomes them in course of the story. We find that. So that is all about the different marriages that take place. And I hope that this class is not that it's sufficient for discussing such an elaborate topic. We may have a class on group discussion, or we will throw a question at you and we will see what your responses are. So that's all for today. Thank you very much.